Hi, welcome to our presentation by Catherine, Jordan, Geoff, and Pat. We will be focusing on radical invention. We will prove the ways in which invention made the United States the most powerful and advanced society today. First, we'll start with the introduction, and then we will set up the problems using the colonial and revolutionary periods. Then, we will focus on antebellum intervention, which are steamboat, telegraph, mower reaper, and the steel plow. Then we'll jump into the conclusion where we talk about how these inventions improved the United States. Inventions have the power to change the future even if it's just a simple machine. The aqueducts allowed Romans to irrigate their crops, the wheel led to wagons and cars, computers are an everyday object now. The following inventions, the steamboat, telegraph, mower reaper, and the steel plow, all had instantaneous and lasting impacts on the world as we know it today.
Setting up the problems. Colonial period. Pre-steamboat. Before steamboats, people relied on animals to travel from place to place. For example, South Carolina to Virginia. When they were traveling from place to place, it was very slow and dangerous. Also took long amount of times for this to be completed, maybe because of weather or terrain. The transportations were horse and carriage, trains, and barefoot, but mostly walking in horse and carriage. Trains were mostly for goods, and in some rarities, people could travel on trains to get to place.
Before the telegraph was invented, communication was a very long and slow process. In the colonial period, the settlers used flame beacons, heliographs, which are a device that uses the sun's rays to flash signals, and according to the Merriam-Webster dictionary, it's an apparatus for telegraphing by means of the sun's rays flashed from a mirror. They also used letters which were delivered by horseback or by foot, and these could take days or weeks to reach other people or states. By the time the message was received, it would be outdated and it would be too late to act upon. The first image on the left is an example of a flame beacon. The second image is an example of the heliograph, and the last image on the far right is an example of a messenger on horseback.
So during the colonial period, for the pre-mower reaper time, people used tools such as axes, funnels, gimlets, which is on the bottom. It's the one that's kind of like a drill, and chisels. And they were used as just tools like around the farm and that kind of thing. Axes used for cutting down trees. Gimlet was used for drilling. Chisel used for, I think, cutting trees as well, or cutting like into trees. And then a funnel was used for things like cement or pouring a liquid into a small area. Many of these technologies are still used today, but yeah.
Before the invention of the steel plow, plows are still being used in colonial America, but they are not very practical. Wood plows are the oldest yet the most popular form of plow from the colonial period until the antebellum period. Before the invention of the steel plow, people attempted to use a cast iron plow. However, dirt would always get stuck in the moldboard underneath, causing farmers to have to stop very frequently to clean the soil from their plows.
Setting up the problem. Revolutionary period. Pre-steamboat. During the Revolutionary period, transportation were as followed: horses, sleds, wagons. The pre-shadow to actual steamboats, the flatland boats, covered wagons, which were wagons with a hood made of canvas to protect travelers from rain and snow, but they mostly walked. When they were traveling during the Revolutionary period without steamboats, it was very dangerous because of the surrounding terrain and weather. Plus, you had people who would want to steal their goods or go to the serious lengths and kill them. Who knows?
There weren't many improvements between the colonial and revolutionary periods as far as communication, but if you looked at our Revolution Within project, we focused on the Bill of Rights, and we learned that it took delegates too long to get to Virginia for the Constitutional Convention, so the Virginia Plan was created without them, and this was because of a lack of communication between the states, and it took too long for messages to get between the states. Drums were also used during this period because sound could travel over longer distances faster than messengers, so drums were used to exchange information. The semaphore was also a method. However, this method was limited by the weather and the need for an uninterrupted line of sight between receptor points, according to Histroy.com. The semaphore consisted of stations that were set up on hilltops, and each station had two large arms that were movable, as well as two telescopes, which were used to view other stations. If you look on the right, you can see a chart that is depicting the different letters and their corresponding movements that were used by the semaphore to communicate across long distances.
So, for the Revolutionary period, before the motor reaper, people had to go around their wheat fields and use physical tools and their hands to grab the wheat. So, the tool that they would use to cut everything is called a scythe. I think it might still be used today. It's like, I know, like, you could find them probably in a store or something. Anyway, a scythe, which is used to chop down wheat. That one's the one people used to go to their wheat fields and just use a scythe and kind of drag it along the wheat, and it would cut the wheat. It's essentially a large, like curved sword almost. It has a sharp blade that cuts it down, and then on the right is an assortment of tools used for farming. Those consist of tools like rakes, I think that's a shovel, and those are just used for grabbing the wheat that has been cut down and putting it in a wagon or a wheelbarrow or something like that.
During the Revolutionary period, not much had changed. People were still heavily relying on the wooden plow. However, by this time, more people had started to use simple forms of moldboard plows and cast iron plows. These plows are usually horse-drawn, with one large blade and one moldboard being dragged behind through the soil to help loosen it up.
Antebellum inventions. The steamboat. The steamboat was invented by Robert Fulton in 1807, in which there was a safer and more reliable way to ship goods and people from place to place, country to country. Once it was invented in 1807, America's rivers opened to commercial trade and passenger transportation from, let's say, the Hudson River to the Mississippi River. It also carried President James Monroe from New York to Staten Island. And effects of the steamboat at the time of the invention: traveled up and down the Mississippi River, allowed for more efficient transportation for perishable foods. They carried people and goods from one place to another. River travel, which means up and down rivers to different states, was often very slow because of the speed of travel, but more efficient and more safe. The boats went up to a max speed of 5 miles an hour. Nowadays, it's like 40 plus, I think, or a little under 40. When the English Navy began to blockade the United States ports during the War of 1812, Fulton was hired by the U.S. government to design the first steam-powered warship called the Demologus.
The antebellum invention that I focused on was the telegraph. It was invented in 1832 by a man named Samuel F.B. Morse. Samuel F.B. Morse was born in Charlestown, Massachusetts, and he graduated from Yale College in 1810. After graduation, he started an apprenticeship in Boston. However, his interest in art caused his father to decide to send him to college in England, And then when he returned in 1815, he opened a studio for art. 2 years later, in 1817, he married Lucretia Walker and would have 3 children with her. In 1825, Lucretia died while giving birth to the 3rd child. Morse was away from home during this time, working on a painting, and received word by letter that his wife was ill, and when he rushed home, by the time he got there, his wife had passed and he had been buried. Then he went to go grieve in Europe. During his return trip, however, he met Charles Thomas Jackson, who inspired Morse to begin drafting blueprints for what would become the telegraph. He struggled to get one to work, and he paired up with Alfred Vail, and together the pair invented Morse code in 1838. And then he struggled to find investors for the telegraph, but eventually in 1844, he sent his first message via telegraph from Washington, D.C. to Maryland, which was 38 miles away. The picture on the right is a picture of Samuel Morse. The effect of the telegraph back when it was invented was extremely monumental for that time period. The telegraph allowed communication between the states to be quicker. The first message from Morse was from Washington, D.C. to Baltimore, Maryland, and the message is now famous, and he said, "What hath God wrought?" Then a telegraph wire was placed from coast to coast, which was New York to London, and according to Histroy.com, that made the world much smaller because the 2 different continents could communicate a lot quicker. Also, as a result of the telegraph, the politics and business industry changed drastically. Countries could communicate more efficiently, and that led to world peace because they could talk about any issues that were arising between them, and also international news could spread faster. On the right, there's a picture of Morse who's installing one of the telegraph wires.
So for the mower reaper, the mower reaper was made in 1831. Before I get into the mower reaper, I'll talk about its inventor, Cyrus McCormick. So he was born in 1809. He was a blacksmith. His father patented the idea of a mower reaper, or of this type of technology, and Cyrus believed it was his idea to finish it. He finished the work that his father had started with the reaper. His father had patents for it, but could never get it to work. He started to sell the machine after he got to work. He started to sell the machine to his friends and people who lived around him. But as word spread, as word spread, he sold more. He was considered the father of agriculture. In 1847, Cyrus founded McCormick Harvesting Machine Company. McCormick's reaper won the gold medal at the Crystal Palace exhibition in London in 1851. There were many court cases related to this patent for the reaper. There was one individual who, I think he signed up for a patent before Cyrus was able to go in and patent essentially the upgraded version of what his father had produced. Some gentleman went in and he patented something that looked very similar and worked very similar. So they had like a battle to see whose worked better. And Cyrus won that battle because it started to rain that day, and the other gentleman's machine broke down. Cyrus's did not. Cyrus McCormick died in 1884. Upon McCormick's death, his company was handed down to his oldest son, Cyrus McCormick Jr. So the effect of the mower reaper at the time it was made, it changed farming forever. No doubt about that. Even till today, if this technology didn't exist, I feel like it would have existed if Cyrus didn't make it. But there was a worry that people wouldn't be able to cut down enough wheat, and it ended strenuous labor, and it made it faster and easier to harvest. It was easier for a single person to tend to acres of grain opposed to a large workforce. The way it used to work was people used to go out in groups with scythes and cut down all the wheat. And this technology allowed for farmers to have more land. It made the possibility of food shortages less likely. So this is a quote from our NAIC. The men employed on the farm were always glad to hear her prattle. She was great. She was a great favorite with them. Sorry about that. This quote is stating how men who worked on the farms are always happy to see Fredo. This is talking about the Belmont's farm. And besides that, in the book Arnig, the men worked on the Belmont's farm. They probably had like related to the struggles of that I've mentioned above, like the lack of a mower reaper, where groups of men. It says employees, probably 20 or so. Like 10 would go out to like an acre and cut down and grab all the wheat and that kind of thing. And yeah, just from seeing how they had a farm, I believe that they may have struggled with the lack of this technology.
John Deere, the inventor of the steel plow, was born on February 7th, 1804. He was raised by a single mother who had very little money. This is because people believed that his father died at sea after setting sail for England in 1807 and never being heard from again. By the age of 17, he'd apprenticed himself and he'd learned how to become a blacksmith. In 1836, he traveled to Grand Detour, Illinois, for a fresh start as a young father looking to capitalize on the fact that his blacksmith skills would be in high demand in Grand Detour. The pioneer farmers were having trouble cultivating the thick soil with the plows intended for light, sandy New England soil. So in 1837, Deere decided to make a plow out of what was an old broken, and he partnered with Leonard Andrus several years later so that he could make enough plows to meet his new high demands. However, this partnership was lasted, and it dissolved after 5 years when Deere moved to Moline, Illinois. He moved there because there was cheaper coal and transportation, and this would allow him to set up a factory. In 1850, his production was up to 1,600 plows a year, along with other complementary tools for the plows. In 1858, John Deere passed the leadership of his company onto his son while retaining his presidency. Following this, his later retirement endeavors, he spent time as the mayor of Moline, as well as becoming the founder and president of the National Bank of Moline, where he died on May 17th. The steel plow went through dirt much faster than the regular plow. This allowed people to cultivate more land and allowed them to plant more food. And now they could plow faster than they ever could before. This caused the work to become less physically demanding, and it also led to the creation and expansion of newer and larger farms. He also began a factory in Moline, which employed roughly 65 people. Around this time, at the start of his company, historian Wayne Burrell Jr. wrote that Deere must have given a great deal of thought to the shape. The special curve of his moldboard for its exact contours would determine just how well the soil will be turned over after the share had made the cut. Deere used his time to build connections, and within the first 20 years of his business, after moving to Moline, he was distributing widely around the nation. And this wide expansion and high profit allowed him to begin to experiment with several new styles of plow.
The effects of the steamboat today, more advanced, more durable, more strength, and can carry more goods and people and get them to their destination faster and more efficiently.
Even though the telegraph was invented in 1832, we can still see its lasting effects today. Alexander Graham Bell, who invented the telephone, according to Bellis, his attempt to improve the telegraph is what led to the telephone being invented. During 1877, the first telephone line was created between Boston and Somerville, Massachusetts, and also in 1877, the Bell Telephone Company was created, and in 1880, the American Telephone and Telegraph Company was created, which we now know as AT&T. In 1878 was the first telephone exchange, and that meant that phones could be connected to 100 other wires with the flip of a switch rather than only being limited to one other phone. In 1889, payphones were invented by William Gray, and in 1980, there were more than 175 million phone booths in the United States. However, this rapidly declined with the introduction of cell phones, and today there are less than 500,000 that are still operational. Cordless phones were introduced in the 1970s, and digital cordless phones were more widespread in 1994. And with the introduction of all these types of phones, telephone books, 911, and caller ID were implemented in order to improve the uses of phones in the country. On the right, at the top right corner, you can see Alexander Graham Bell, and on the bottom right, you can see the first phone booth.
So the effect of the mower reaper today, in today's society, the mower reaper is now a harvester that people see in fields. It's called a harvester, combine harvester. I often call it a tractor because that's kind of what it looks like. So on the left is what the mower reaper looks like. Essentially, uses it's a horseback technology. It drives as gears spin that turn this little doohickey that essentially is a bunch of scythes that cuts the wheat and places it on this little platform. I don't know how visible that is. And then on the right is the more updated version of a harvester, where essentially the horses provide the power in the one from the 1800s. Currently, it's all like engines and technology and that kind of stuff. I think nowadays it's more technology than just engine powered.
The John Deere company is still a major tractor and farming supply brand today. The brand now sells tractors, mowers, and other advanced products to help farmers. The Deere company has now 37,000 employees. It can produce $12 billion worth of equipment a year. They now also have 21 factories and locations across the United States and Canada, and the network is no longer just nationwide, it is worldwide with network connections in 110 different countries.